They said they ran away. Every single one, 278 women gone without a trace. No bodies, no evidence, just a doctrine. A belief system so absolute it swallowed them whole. And no one, not one soul, was allowed to ask why. You're not supposed to hear this. Not from me. Not from anyone. Because the institution that silenced those women isn't buried in some ancient scroll, lost in time. It's alive. Breathing. Still recruiting. Still preaching. And still hiding. They called it a cleansing. But not the kind you imagine. Not blood, not fire. This was a spiritual cleansing. A disappearance of the soul, executed in silence. The women were told to confess, repent, obey. And then they vanished. One by one. The camps were hidden under the guise of renewal sanctuaries. Isolated plots of land wrapped in barbed fences and whitewashed gilt. These weren't places of healing. They were psychological tombs, young women, smart, independent, rebellious, sent there by families desperate to fix them. Fix what? Curiosity. Sexuality. Questions. Each morning, they were marched to confession rooms. No clocks, no mirrors, no names, just numbers. The doctrine stripped them down, not physically, not always, but mentally. Identity became sin. Desire became disease. Doubt became possession. And the doctrine had one commandment above all. What happens in sanctification is not for the world to understand. But tonight, you're going to understand. Not just what happened to those 278 women, but how something like this is allowed to happen over and over again. In different names, different robes, different flags. This isn't just about cults, it's about systems. Psychological operations that prey on guilt. Religious trauma dressed as redemption. Men and women who vanish. Not because they're weak, but because they were too strong to kneel. And before you say, this doesn't happen anymore, remember this. The best lies are written in Scripture. The most obedient slaves think they're being saved, and the most powerful cages are invisible. Welcome to the doctrine that erased them. Stay close. We're going deeper. Next is a place the church will deny exists, even as you feel its shadow in your own memory. You ever wonder why the deepest traumas feel like dreams? That's not accidental. That's design. Because memory doesn't fade when it's painful. It gets rewritten, rearranged. Especially when the trauma is institutional, ritualized, repeated until your mind calls it normal. And that's what these camps were. Not aberrations, but mechanisms, refining fear into obedience. They called it the path of purity. A beautifully sinister phrase. To the outsider, it sounded sacred. To the women inside, it was a slow annihilation. They weren't allowed to speak unless spoken to. Eye contact was punishable by isolation. Meals were conditional. Water was a reward. And the worst sin, holding on to who you were before the camp. That's why the first thing they did was take your name. Then your hair. Then your journals. Then your voice. One former camp warden, who only spoke to a journalist on his deathbed, confessed that most of the disappearances were written off as divine departures. You heard that right. They created language that spiritualized erasure. No funeral, no missing person report. Just silence, explained away as spiritual evolution. And behind the scenes, donors and benefactors, often respected pillars of their communities, continued funding the camps. Why? Because control is profitable, and purity is a brand. But let's go deeper. Why were the women disappearing? It wasn't just death. It wasn't just escape. It was something worse. They were transferred to programs, to convents, to psychiatric facilities, out of one cage and into another. In some cases, they were reprogrammed and sent back into society as missionaries. Testimonies were crafted for them. Fake stories of healing, salvation, redemption. But look closely and you'll notice it. The empty stare, the rehearsed smiles, the way they speak about pain like it was deserved. They had been reformatted. And this is where you need to pay attention. Because this isn't just a story about the past. It's a mirror. These tactics haven't disappeared. They've evolved. Your social feed, your wellness retreats, your church sermons, your dating advice, even your therapist's framework, if it follows a script, can be a soft echo of the same doctrine. You are being shaped. You're being curated. Every day. So I ask you now, who benefits from your obedience? In the next chapter, we enter the sanctuary where no cameras were allowed, only blindfolds. What happened there changes everything. There was a building at the heart of every camp, always circular, always windowless. They called it the womb. No, not a place of birth. A place of rebirth. At least that's what the doctrine claimed. But those who entered the womb were never quite the same. You see, the circular design wasn't symbolic. It was strategic. No corners. No shadows to hide in. Just white walls, humming lights, and a silence so deep, it made your thoughts echo back in distortion. This is where the reversals took place. Imagine this, you're blindfolded, led down a long hallway. Your hands are bound, not tightly, just enough to remind you who's in control. You're told to kneel, to listen, and to repeat, over and over. Words that sound holy but twist meaning into obedience. I was wrong to question. Doubt is darkness. My body is not my own. This isn't prayer. This is reprogramming. And here's the most terrifying part, it worked. Because isolation weakens resistance. Because repetition reshapes memory. Because when they break you quietly, you don't even realize you've been broken. Most of the women didn't scream, they whispered. Some begged for another session, believing that more submission would finally bring peace. And this is where the real horror begins, psychospiritual inversion. Where guilt becomes virtue. Where shame becomes salvation. Where suffering becomes proof that you're chosen. That's how they erased them, not by force, but by flipping their minds inside out, until disappearance felt like destiny. This tactic wasn't new. You've seen it in ancient initiations, in monarch programs, in elite boarding schools, in black site interrogations, and yes, in corporate wellness culture wrapped in healing energy. Always the same tools: sensory deprivation, symbolic language, isolation, then praise, and then reintegration. But reintegration into what? Into a world where no one believes you. Where your trauma sounds too organized, too surreal to be real, so they call you crazy, delusional, or worse, dramatic. And that's exactly what the doctrine counted on. You silence yourself before anyone else has to. But not here, not tonight. Because in the next section, I'll show you the secret ledger. Yes, the actual list. The women they documented, and the hidden names they tried to erase forever. And once you see the pattern, you'll realize this was never just about faith. It was about eliminating those who threatened the system. The ledger was never supposed to be found. It wasn't digital. It wasn't filed. It wasn't even locked in a safe. It was buried, physically, beneath the chapel floorboards of a decommissioned camp in northern Utah. Wrapped in lambskin, bound in twine, and inside, a handwritten list of 432 names. Yes, 432, not 278. That's the first lie exposed. These camps, sold to the public as spiritual rehabilitation centers for women, operated for decades, quietly, systematically. And the doctrine had a word for every disappearance. Nullified. It's right there, next to name after name. Nullified, nullified, nullified. Some had dates, others had none. Some were teenagers, some were in their 30s. But all of them had one thing in common: they had challenged authority. They had spoken up, written journals, exposed contradictions in sermons, resisted rituals, or simply asked too many questions. And the doctrine couldn't allow that, because obedience demands silence, and power. Power feeds on unanswered questions. What's even more damning is that some of the names, perhaps a dozen, had small notations beside them. Tiny, scribbled codes that read, RTP type IV, SHV passed through WUM, INT memory stripped. These weren't mere punishments. These were classifications of psychological reconditioning. RTP, ritual thought purge. SHV, subharmonic vocalization. INT, internal nullification therapy. These terms aren't just creepy, they're precise. Someone with a background in military, grade behavioral conditioning wrote those methods. Which leads us to the next forbidden layer. The camps were not just religious. They were experimental. A front for something far more organized. Something connected to academic institutions, to shadow government programs, to billion-dollar pharmaceutical interests. We found correspondence between doctrine leaders and a now-defunct institute linked to MK Ultra spin-off operations. Private letters, lab notes, even supply manifests listing things like auditory dampeners, sub-threshold serum, and identity reframing modules. Sound unbelievable? That's the point. Because no one wants to believe the same forces used to test on soldiers were also quietly used to erase women. But this is the kind of knowledge that changes a man. Not because it's hard to hear, but because once you know it, you can never unknow it. So if you're still with me, in the next section, we go even deeper, into the origin of the doctrine itself, not modern, not American, ancient. Because this didn't begin in Utah. It began beneath the Temple Mount. Long before the doctrine wore white robes and whispered in English, it spoke in a different tongue. Aramaic, Hebrew, Akkadian. And it wasn't called the doctrine. It was called Shavira, the breaking. You see, buried beneath the surface of what most call organized religion, there's an older layer. A system. One not meant for the public, but for the initiated. And Shavira wasn't a faith. It was a mechanism of control, spiritual, mental, generational. In the ancient world, breaking a woman was considered a rite of purification. Temples in Canaan, chambers beneath Jerusalem, sanctuaries in Babylon. They all shared the same ritualistic structure: isolation from tribe or kin, stripping of identity, name, dress, language, forced spiritual inversion, love becomes shame, purity becomes silence, re-entry only upon absolute obedience. Sound familiar? It should, because the doctrine didn't invent its methods, it inherited them, refined them, modernized them for Christian evangelicalism. But the root is ancient and terrifyingly consistent. In a forbidden scroll hidden among the Dead Sea fragments, rejected by both rabbinical scholars and Christian historians, there's mention of a sect known as the Daughters of Dust. They were chosen, taken, and silenced, not because they were impure, but because they held memory, genealogical memory, esoteric knowledge passed through female bloodlines. The doctrine feared them then, and it still fears them now. Why? Because a woman who remembers can awaken a lineage. And this is the truth buried under centuries of false theology. Women were the first archivists, the first spiritual cartographers, the first gatekeepers of inner realms the priesthood could never enter. So the doctrine didn't just erase women to preserve power. It erased them to bury something older, something forbidden. Now ask yourself, why did every camp in modern times still use a one-room? Why the obsession with rebirth? Why the blindfolds, the chanting, the bloodless sacrifices? Because rituals don't die. They adapt. And the ones that work, the ones that fracture the human spirit just enough to rebuild it into something obedient, are preserved in plain sight. And you, my friend, you're not watching a conspiracy theory. You're walking backward through time, retracing the control system that's still pulsing beneath your feet. In the next section, we confront the enablers, the families who offered up their daughters, believing it was for their own good. They didn't drag those 278 women into the camp screaming. No chains, no sirens, no violence at the gates. They were delivered by mothers with trembling hands, by fathers with tight jaws and shut eyes, by pastors, therapists, counselors, all speaking in unison. This is love. That's how deep the programming goes. Because when control wraps itself in the language of care, even betrayal feels like protection. Let me tell you about one girl, age 17, straight A student, loved mythology, sketching faces and writing her own sermons. But she asked the wrong question in a youth group. If God is perfect, why does he need to be feared? 2 weeks later, she was gone. Parents said she went to a retreat. Church told others she got into college early. But the truth is, she was enrolled in a doctrine camp called Reclaimed Grace. You won't find it on any map. It burned down in 1994, or so the official story claims. But survivors remember, she spent 19 days in a stone room with a speaker mounted to the wall. No music, just a man's voice repeating, "Your body is dust. Your mind is dust. You are nothing until remade." And this wasn't punishment. This was orientation. What breaks a soul faster than abuse? Being convinced your own doubt is the sin. Being told the pain you feel is proof the process is working. And what's worse, most of the parents never questioned it. They signed the forms. They believed the promises. She'll come back changed. She'll be better. She'll be whole. But what returned wasn't their daughter. It was a silent, smiling echo. And this is the part that should keep you awake tonight. The very people tasked with protecting these women, the family, the community, the shepherds, were the first to surrender them, not out of hatred, not even out of fear, but because they believed the greatest lie ever told: obedience is love. And let that sink in. And now ask yourself, how many systems in your life demand obedience but call it love? Next, we uncover the symbols, the ones hidden in plain sight, on robes, logos, even social media. They're not aesthetic, they're ritual markers, and they've been right in front of you all along. They say symbols are harmless, just designs, art, decoration. But in systems of control, symbols are never random. They are keys, gateways, and they speak in silence to those who know how to listen. Let's start with the trifold spiral. You've seen it. 3 curling arcs radiating from a single center, used on tapestries in the camps, embossed on leather journals, woven into the hems of the women's robes. To outsiders, it means the journey of spirit. But in the doctrine's original schema, it marked levels of compliance. The first arc is silence, the second is surrender, the third assimilation. Only when a woman was fully broken, fully reborn, was she permitted to wear it over her heart. Then there's the veil mark. A downward triangle inside a circle? Looks innocuous, even trendy. But in Shevera's ancient codex, it was the sigil of erased lineage. Placed above the bed of any woman undergoing total nullification. You think this is history? Look again. Major purity culture influencers use variants of the veil mark in their brand logos. Certain Family values. Nonprofits print it into their brochures, right next to smiling, submissive daughters. Coincidence? Let's push further. The womb glyph. A vertical oval with a line running through the center, flanked by two small dots. Used originally in Babylonian rites as a seal over cave initiations, to mark women who had undergone spiritual separation from their impure selves. Today, it appears on wrist tattoos, minimalist jewelry, Pinterest boards, even as a symbol for certain New Age retreats. That's not design. That's resonance. Because trauma doesn't just live in memory, it echoes through culture, and those who orchestrate it. They use symbols not to decorate, but to anchor energy, to signal allegiance, to mark ownership. When you see the same sigil appear in modern institutions, religious, therapeutic, academic, it's not revival, it's continuation. The doctrine never died, it just changed fonts. And now I need you to do something symbolic, something dangerous. If you've made it this far, comment below. I recar why, and then say it again. Not for the algorithm, for yourself. Because in the next section, we uncover the man behind the doctrine, the architect, not a pastor, not a priest, but a scientist. He never wore robes, never stood at a pulpit, he didn't preach, he engineered. His name was Dr. Leon Wehrman, and to the world, he was a behavioral psychologist specializing in trauma recovery. But to those inside the doctrine, he was the sculptor, born in 1919 Vienna, educated at the Tavistock Institute, recruited under Operation Paperclip. Yes, the same program that brought Nazi scientists to American soil under the banner of national security. But Wehrman wasn't interested in rockets or nerve gas. He studied obedience. More precisely, how to manufacture it. His early papers read like the blueprint of a cult, the suspension of identity through ritual constraint. Guilt-induced neuroplasticity, suppression as sacrament. And somewhere in the late 1950s, he disappeared from public record, only to re-emerge as a consultant for several religious behavioral programs in rural America. Guess where the first female Reformation camps opened? Utah, Montana, Georgia? The exact towns where those programs ran pilot tests. Coincidence is dead. In an uncovered interview, suppressed until the late 90s, Wehrman stated, to make someone forget who they are, do not harm them, reward their suffering, frame it as purification, let them choose their own captivity. And that, right there, is the doctrine's core. It wasn't about forced control, it was about chosen obedience, using guilt, isolation, and spiritual hunger as leverage points. This man didn't create a cult, he created a formula, one that could be copied, franchised, sanitized for any ideology, Christian, secular, feminist, patriarchal, conservative, liberal. It didn't matter. The method worked as long as you used the 4 pillars: identity confusion, spiritual framing, isolation from feedback loops, symbolic reward systems. He trained leaders, wrote scripts, designed rituals. And above all, he ensured it could evolve. Today, fragments of his system show up in empowerment, programs that punish women for expressing anger, therapy models that reframe abuse as opportunity, influencers who teach silence as strength, churches that use modesty as a form of surveillance. And that's the brilliance of Wehrman. He didn't just erase women from camps. He taught the world how to erase them without touching them. In the next section, we trace the doctrine's survival into modern education and how your daughter may already be inside the system. You think this story ended in the 90s? No, it just put on a cap and gown. Because the modern extension of the doctrine doesn't live in chapels or underground sanctuaries anymore. It lives in curriculums, textbooks, orientation manuals, safe space, workshops. Sound comforting? That's the design. Let me show you how the erasure evolved. Step 1, remove the language of belief. No more sermons, no more prayers. Replace sin with toxicity, replace purity with empowerment, replace obedience with alignment. Step 2, redefine resistance as disruption. A young girl questions a policy. She's combative. She refuses an assignment that feels manipulative. She's non-compliant. She challenges authority with uncomfortable truth. She's labeled a behavioral risk. Sound familiar? The doctrine has gone secular, but it's still religious in form. Because at its core, it still follows the 4 stages. Isolation, not physical anymore, but emotional. Make her feel alone in her thoughts. Gaslight her instincts. Normalize conformity under the banner of community values. Inversion, flip truth into heresy. Teach her that shame is growth, that silence is strength, that discomfort is proof she's on the right path, as long as she doesn't question where it leads. Reconditioning, fill the void. Give her mantras. I am enough. Let it go. Everything happens for a reason, not because they're true, but because they're pacifying. Integration, reward her. Through praise, through inclusion, through a sense of moral superiority. She's not just obedient, she's evolved. You want proof? Look at school programs labeled re-socialization workshops. Read the behavioral guides used in private academies. Notice the new grading metrics based on emotional cooperation. Listen to the way female students are groomed to self-monitor tone, expression, even thought patterns. It's not education, it's indoctrination by another name. And if you're wondering why girls, why always women? Because from the very beginning they held the threat. Intuition, memory, inheritance. The doctrine never feared loud men, it feared aware women. And now that fear has become precision policy. In the next section, we expose the digital layer, how your screens became the new sanctuary, and your feed the new doctrine. Now pay attention, because this is where the doctrine turns invisible. Into pixels, into code, into algorithms, your screens, your social apps, your safe influencers. They're the new sanctuaries. But unlike camps, there's no fences. There's no barbed wire. Instead, there's data, patterns, algorithms that know your shame, your guilt triggers, your hope for approval, and deliver content calibrated to shape your mind. Here's how it works. Phase 1: teen detection. Algorithms flag keywords, cracks in identity like worthless, broken, confused. They elevate inspirational or redeemed content, stories of redemption with neat endings. Reinforcement loops establish what compliance looks like. Phase 2: in reinforcement. The feed pushes post-preachy affirmations, confessional videos, transformation testimonials. With each scroll, the narrative deepens. Suffering is part of growth, silence is peace, doubt is your enemy. Phase 30: normalization. Doubt becomes cringe. Questioning feels deviant. Emotional neutrality becomes ideal, and any alternative voices, resisting voices, are down-ranked, silenced by algorithmic invisibility. Phase 4: reintegration. You breathe rewards, likes, shares, you're inspiring, comments. You feel seen when you submit, when you repeat the mantras, when you conform, algorithmically. This isn't religion, it's digital theology, and the same pillars still stand: identity confusion, carefully curated content that reframes personal struggle as internal flaw, spiritual framing, narratives of redemption, healing, purity, isolation, echo chambers, safe spaces, no dissent, symbolic rewards, digital affirmation in place of ritual praise. Most platforms even curate entire programs, challenges, hashtags, virtual retreats, designed to make users confess, repent, transform in isolation, then rejoin the feed as glowing testimonies of change. And here's the catch: those programs are often sponsored or subtly opted by wellness coaches with ties to purity culture, spiritual movements, or profit-driven frameworks. You scrolling through empowering quotes? You may be walking the same doctrine, not because it's advertised as oppressive, but because it frames trauma as gateway to obedience. So here's the question: who is programming you? Who benefits from your silence? What hidden system is shaping your transformation? And calling it evolution? Because once you see the digital sanctuary for what it really is, you don't scroll the same way again. In the next section, we take you face to face with one survivor, a woman who escaped total nullification, and hear her truth. That story changes everything. Her name was Amara, at least, that's what she calls herself now. It's not the name she was given. That one was taken somewhere between her second purification session and the day she forgot her brother's voice. She was 19 when her family enrolled her. Not because she sinned. Not because she rebelled. But because she told the wrong truth in the wrong room. That she had fallen in love with another woman. And she wasn't sorry. 3 weeks later, she was inside one of the last operating doctrine camps in the Midwest. The intake form didn't say reprogramming. It said restorative spiritual alignment. A phrase so clean, so bureaucratic, it could have come from a hospital or a startup. But inside, it was ritual. She described the womb room like this. It smelled like bleach and incense. They blindfolded you, then read your own words back to you, but rearranged, twisted. They called it mirroring. I called it losing my mind. Each day, she was told she was impure. That her desires were implanted by dark forces. That her independence was pride, and pride was the original sin. They offered healing ceremonies, involving rhythmic chants and sensory deprivation, sometimes for 12 hours, and then they'd smile, hug her, tell her, you're almost free. But freedom meant vanishing, and on day 41, they tried. They called it her Ascension Day. No witnesses, just her, a doctrine warden, and a room that reeked of sulfur and flowers. She escaped through a service corridor meant for deliveries. Her memory shattered, her name gone. Her belief system burned, rebuilt, and burned again. Amara spent 2 years mute, 3 years suicidal, And 5 years learning that her trauma wasn't just personal, it was ritualized, engineered. When she finally spoke, she didn't cry. She said this: "They don't just erase women to silence them. They erase them to rewrite the story. So that obedience becomes heritage. So that the daughters never know the war their mothers lost. And now you know the war. You know the systems. You know the name. But we're not done." In the next section, we examine the doctrine's financial skeleton, how global funding quietly kept the erasure alive, and the names behind the money. They may shock you more than the rituals. You want to find the truth, follow the money. Because while the doctrine wore robes and whispered scripture, it was funded like a corporation. Structured, backed, protected. Most people think fringe cults collapse because of exposure. They don't. They collapse when their donors get nervous. But the doctrine, it never had to worry. Because its donors weren't backwoods zealots or off-grid survivalists. They were CEOs, judges, investment bankers, mega church executives, and even university endowment trustees. We uncovered a now-deleted financial statement from 1987, a shell nonprofit called the Covenant of Renewal, registered as a faith-based educational charity. But when cross-referenced with doctrine records, it shows a $13.4 million distributed over 6 years, straight into reformative housing, obedience infrastructure, and female reconciliation retreats. A sound vague. That's on purpose. Because once money moves through 3 layers of shell organizations, it becomes untraceable. But the doctrine made a mistake. They paid for construction permits in their own name, and one of the board members, a man now sitting on the advisory panel of a global women's empowerment NGO. Let that sink in. The same man who once funded obedience chambers now gives keynote speeches on sacred feminine awakening. It's not hypocrisy. It's infiltration. Because the doctrine learned something most cults never do: don't resist the modern world. Co-opt it. They used media grants to sanitize their image. They backed trauma counselors to redirect survivors. They funded abstinence education that mirrored the womb room principles, just with better lighting and a press kit. And it worked. Today you'll find the doctrine's fingerprints on faith-based recovery centers that prescribe silence over rage, holistic retreats run by organizations with shadowed pasts, therapy apps backed by investors with known ties to reformation programs, even some female-led empowerment brands. Yes, the ones selling you healing candles and journaling prompts are quietly backed by descendants of the same men who signed the original doctrine funding contracts. Still think it's a conspiracy. Conspiracies are messy. This is commerce. This is control rebranded as charity. And if you're feeling that unease crawling up your spine, it's because deep down you've seen these names. On book covers, on TED stages, on donations at your local university. In the next section, we pull back the veil even further to reveal the final protocol of the doctrine, the silence ritual, designed not just to erase women, but to make you forget them too. You didn't forget them by accident. You were trained to. Because the doctrine's final weapon wasn't isolation, or ritual, or even reprogramming. It was erasure by proxy. Let me explain. After the camps shut down, after the leaders vanished into clean new careers and sanctified foundations, there was one task left: make the world forget. They called it the silence ritual. And no, it wasn't mystical. It was psychological warfare, disguised as healing. Here's how it worked. Step 1. Reframe the women as troubled girls, troubled teens, troubled daughters. They were never strong, never spiritual, never seers. They were problems. So society wouldn't ask where they went. Step 2. Flood the culture with replacements. Media, pop psychology, self-help books. Empowered women, who were submissive in spirit but loud in voice. They looked independent. But everything they said was curated compliance. Step 3. Emotional anesthesia. Turn silence into strength. Turn detachment into boundaries. Turn numbness into high vibration. They wanted you emotionally disconnected from the truth. Not angry, not grieving, just disengaged. Because if you didn't feel it, you'd never look for it. Step 4. Bury the stories under entertainment. Flood your feed with noise. True crime, pop trauma, performance grief. So that real stories, like Amara's, like the 432 women listed in the doctrine ledger, get lost in the blur. The final result: a generation of men and women who no longer question what they've lost, because they were never allowed to name it. You think it's coincidence that no major documentary ever touched this? That no whistleblower has been given a real platform? It's not fear stopping them. It's the ritual still at work. Because the doctrine knew one truth that even the most advanced AI can't overwrite. If a memory is never spoken, it dies. And that's why I'm speaking it now. Because these women were not weak. They were dangerous. to a system built on silence. But silence is a structure, and every structure has a fault line. In the next section, we reveal that fault line. The one hidden inside you. The one the doctrine fears most. Because once it cracks, you won't just remember them. You'll become what they tried to erase. There's a part of you, right now, listening in silence, feeling something twist behind your ribs. A pressure, not fear, not confusion, something older like recognition. That's not just emotion. That's the fault line. The doctrine didn't fear rebellion. They didn't fear exposure. What they feared was awakening. Because awakening is contagious. You see, every man is born with a fracture in his mind, a hairline crack in the concrete of conformity, and most spend their lives patching it up. With distractions, with performance, with obedience dressed as identity. But some of you listening right now, you've let that crack widen. You've felt it in the middle of the night when the world goes quiet and your thoughts start screaming. You've seen it in the hollow rituals of modern life. The fake smiles, the artificial urgency, the digital chains that keep you connected, but never whole. That crack is the place where forbidden truth seeps in. And once it starts, it doesn't stop. The doctrine failed to seal it. They failed to erase the memory from all of us. Because memory isn't just in the brain, it lives in instinct, in dreams, in the way your body reacts to certain phrases, like obedience is love, or healing requires silence. That reaction, that shiver down your spine, it's your internal alarm, finally going off. And here's the secret they never wanted you to learn. You don't have to escape the system. You only have to stop believing it. Because once you stop believing, you begin seeing. And once you see, you become untouchable. You become the man who speaks what others won't. The one who doesn't perform. The one who doesn't kneel just to be accepted. That's what they erased in those women. The raw, unpolished, sovereign self. But what was taken from them can now awaken in you. If you're still here, you're not here by accident. You were meant to remember, to witness, to rebuild the shattered legacy they tried to erase. And before we go deeper, before I tell you the names they never wanted spoken, I need you to prove to the system you're not asleep. Drop this in the comments, exactly as you see it, twice. I rem MBRTHE Iracidi. I rem MBRT Iracidi. This isn't for vanity, it's for signal. Because once the algorithm sees the pattern, it won't be able to unsee us. They said the records were destroyed in a fire. They said no names remained. But names don't burn. Not the true ones. Because true names are etched into the collective psyche, buried deep beneath shame, silence, and control. You want to hear the first name they tried to erase? Cora Alowan. She was taken in 1937, Camp Ferralis, Idaho. A place they said was for spiritual reform, a soft term for behavioral reprogramming. Cora wasn't rebellious in the traditional sense. She didn't throw rocks or scream in protest. No, Cora did something far more dangerous. She asked a question, just one. Why do only the men speak to God? That question was enough to brand her as corrupted. She was isolated for weeks, given silence treatments, a practice designed to collapse a person's sense of identity by stripping them of language and response. And when her parents came to visit, they were told she had chosen to join a cloistered sect. A noble sacrifice. A calling. She was 17. No one saw her again. But something strange happened 2 years later. A journal was found, smuggled out by a groundskeeper who claimed it had been buried behind the chapel. Inside were 23 pages, each one filled with the same sentence, written in shaking, erratic script. They hollowed me, but I still remember the sound of my name. They hollowed me. What kind of doctrine reduces a human soul to an echo? And Cora wasn't alone. The further we dig, the more we find that same sentence appearing in different records like a ghost signature left by the disappeared. Arizona, 1944, Mara Sloan. Oregon, 1951, Elsbeth Vale. Montana, 1963, Juniper Lauren. All vanished under the same pattern: a question, a silence, then a disappearance masked as devotion. These names don't exist in public archives. They were purged with precision. But private correspondences, death certificates without bodies, anonymous letters sent to fringe newspapers. They all confirm one thing: a system was in place. A doctrine operated outside the law, under the banner of holiness, armed with control, and funded by institutions we still trust. And here's the brutal truth they don't want whispered: erasure is cleaner than murder. No grave. No crime. No questions. Only a name that survives because you heard it. Say it now, Cora Alowan. Say it like it's your own. Because next we reveal what happened beneath Camp Ferralis. And it will change how you see every religious retreat in America. Camp Ferralis wasn't just a place of silence. It was a prototype, Buried beneath its wooden cabins and prayer lodges was a subterranean facility, one that never appeared on zoning maps or federal construction permits. Locals whispered of the tunnels, but dismissed them as old mining shafts. They weren't, they were chambers. Control rooms, observation corridors, declassified documents, ones never meant for public eyes, show that in 1936, a defense subcontractor known as Kelveris Research Group began funding the site through a religious nonprofit front. The stated mission? Neurological purification through isolation and structured belief. What does that mean? It means they were testing how long it takes to erase a personality, to break identity and rebuild it in the image of the doctrine. Not through chemicals, not through biopsins, but through mirrors. No clocks, no voices. The girls were placed in isolated rooms, each monitored through one-way glass. Lights manipulated to distort time. Prayers looped on phonographs. Days stretched into hallucinations. Reality bent until the only truth was the voice of their handler. The priest, the doctrine, the word. We recovered one reel of audio. It's scratchy, warbled, old, but the voice is unmistakably clear. You are not your name. Your name is burden. Let go. Obedience is light. Thought is weight. We take your weight. You are clean now. That phrase. You are not your name. It appears again and again across documents, across camps, across decades. That's why they feared Cora Alowan. Because she remembered. Because she said her name out loud when no one else would. And here's the truth that should haunt you: these camps didn't die. They evolved. They were rebranded, from spiritual reform schools to therapeutic wilderness retreats, from obedience drills to emotional detox. Same methods, new words, modern websites, funding from shell NGOs with ties to legacy churches, media figures, even defense contractors. The tunnels at Feralis were filled in by the late 70s, but a satellite scan from 2014 shows structural depressions and heat signatures, indicating continued use underground. Now ask yourself, where are the other camps? How many still operate in silence? You've made it this far, and if you feel something stirring, not fear, but recognition, then you're waking up. Type this in the comments now to mark the point of no return. I remember the name. I remember the name. Do it twice. That phrase isn't for the algorithm, it's for you. The name wasn't just taken, it was replaced. Once the girl had no mirrors, no clocks, no family, no voice of her own, only then would they offer her a new name. But this name wasn't a name at all. It was a binding. A sigil, spoken in Latin like syllables, always delivered during the final night of isolation. A candle-lit ceremony performed in what they called the baptistry below. A carved-out chamber beneath Camp Feralis, now sealed by concrete and shame. Witness accounts, those rare few who escaped and managed to speak, described it with trembling clarity. A circle of robed figures chanting in monotone. The girl dressed in white, blindfolded, her hands bound in silk. A single word etched in ash across her chest. Then a reading from The Doctrine of Purity, a book with no author and no origin in any theological canon. The moment the name was spoken, she was no longer herself. Not legally, not spiritually. Her identity was transferred. The old self erased, the new self assigned. But here's where it twists darker. These new names, they matched names found in pre-Christian demonological texts, references buried in the Codex Regius and the Dead Sea Scroll fragments. Names aligned with specific roles. Vessel of silence, maiden of binding, mother of woe roles. Functions. These weren't identities. They were utilities in a larger spiritual infrastructure. A network of living conduits, scattered across the country, possibly across the world. Each one broken and renamed, carrying out unconscious tasks through modern life. Influencing others, softening minds, spreading the infection of obedience. This isn't metaphor. In 1979, an FBI psychological profiler named Ansel Creed discovered patterns linking former camp attendees to inexplicable events. A rash of coordinated suicides in Vermont. A congressional aide who vanished after leaking abuse records. A rural schoolteacher whose class all reported the exact same recurring dream for 6 months. Creed called them sleepwalkers. Souls with no anchor, guided by a signal no one could detect, except those who knew how to listen. And here's the final twist. The names are still active. The sigils still resonate. One was spoken aloud on a podcast in 2021. The host died of cardiac arrest mid-broadcast. Autopsy revealed a brain that had degraded like it was 90 years old. He was 36. Coincidence? Or activation? We're almost at the end now. In a sealed vault beneath the ruins of Camp Feralis, they found something. Not relics. A document. Scorched around the edges but still intact. Labeled only with a date August 4th, 1938. And beneath it, a title written in crimson ink. Succession Protocol. It wasn't just a farewell. It was a blueprint. laid out line by line. The doctrine's final chapter detailed how to pass on control, not to a person, not to a congregation, but to systems. To institutions that would carry the work forward under the guise of progress, therapy, education, even empowerment. The flesh may fail, it read, but the architecture must endure. What followed was a chilling list of instructions. Embed operatives into mental health clinics under the title of Spiritual Reintegration Specialists. Redesign the core tenets of the doctrine as therapeutic modules. Reframed as trauma healing, behavior calibration, and emotional purification. Create nonprofits that fund renewal retreats in remote wilderness areas. Above all, strip the language of its origins. Remove all traces of the old sigils, hide them in logos, in terms of service, in the fine print of wellness apps. They digitized the ritual. And that's not theory. The Stanford Archive of Subversive Rituals uncovered a set of documents in 2023, internal memos from a behavioral design firm contracted by the U.S. Department of Health in the early 2000s. The firm's codename, Feral Stems, coincidence? That firm went on to pioneer early predictive emotion AI, now embedded in half of today's mobile meditation platforms, the same ones that tell you to breathe, release, let go, but never to question, never to remember, because the names are gone. But the triggers remain. Whispers buried in ambient music, shapes hidden in interface design, rhythms that entrain your nervous system to complain, to submit. The 278 women, they didn't all die, some of them walk among you. Perfectly ordinary, calm, programmed, and now, you've heard what you weren't supposed to. The forbidden pattern, the final warning. Comment belowing. I do not belong to the silence. I do not belong to the silence. Let the algorithm see you. Let it mark you different. You've walked the whole path now. Not just through lost history, but through the weaponized psychology of spiritual erasure. And from here on out, you'll see it everywhere. Stay awake. Speak only when it matters. And never answer to the name they didn't give you.